Hi, in this presentation we're going to talk about race and ethnic identity, and this is the source of one of your extra credit opportunities is this presentation. What we're going to do is two different things that may seem quite distinct from one another, but actually they're getting at the same underlying question of how is race and ethnic identity defined in our society. What are the boundaries between different race and ethnic categories, and how is that defined by not only ourselves but by others. So the first thing we're going to do in this presentation is talk about the history of the US Census and how the US Census has been used, how it's changed over time to to measure race. Right. So every 10 years since I think 1790, the U.S. has conducted a census, and they ask about a person's race or ethnic identity, and that has not always been the same. Things have changed quite a bit, and so I think it's an interesting historical look at how these census categories for race and ethnic identity have changed over time. So it also points out that this is a very malleable concept of race, that it's like we talked about earlier in the class. It's a social construction, and we make it up, and you can see how it's been made up and changed over time. So here's the 1810 census, and this one is very similar to what you might find in the census from 1790 to 1840. Here you're making a distinction between free white males and free white females, and then other categories, except for Indians, and then you have slaves. Here, this is this distinction between whites and slaves is made consistently in this time period. The last time you see that the term slave in the U.S. Census is in 1850. So here you see the distinction between color rather than race, but back then it was the distinction between black, white, or mulatto, which is a combination of black and white, and then you have the question about whether the person was a slave or not. In 1870, you have the initial inclusion of other racial groups, including the Chinese and Indians here in 1870. The Chinese, from this point forward, have been on every census as a distinct racial category, the only racial category other than whites and blacks to have, other than whites to have be on all the censuses since this time. Fast forwarding to 1890, you can see an interesting set of possible racial identities. Here you have what we had 20 years earlier with black, white, Chinese, and Indian. They've added Japanese, but very interestingly, they bring back mulatto, and then this concept of quadroon and octoroon. What these refer to is a quadroon would be a person who was 1/4 of black race, and then an octoroon would be 1/8. So if they had, one great grandparent who was black, for example. So here you're getting at a degree of rather, and so they are making a very specific measure of whether a person has any black ancestry, and so somebody who was who had 7 of 8 great grandparents were white, and one of them was black, they would be not considered white at the time. They'd be considered an octoroon, and it was a specific category. So I see this is quite interesting and did not persist in other U.S. censuses, but you can get a sense about how people in 1890 were thinking about race. Now here's the 1930 census. It's a bit blurry, but you can make it out. Here you have a list of different racial categories. What's interesting about this one is that Mexican is listed as a racial category. This is the only census that Mexicans was listed as a race. After this, it was listed as an an ethnicity that is Hispanic ethnicity, and this is a result of Mexican Americans lobbying very hard to remove Mexican as a race, that they did not want to be seen as distinct, racially distinct from whites, that the distinction that was going to be made would be based on ethnicity, something quite different. So in future years, a person could identify as a white person who is of Mexican ethnicity, or a black person who is of Mexican ethnicity, for example. But in 1930, that was the only time that Mexicans were listed as a race. You can see that this is really made up. We're making, you can see the government is changing things around quite a bit and socially constructing what race actually is. In 1950, you have another example of this. You can see that from 1900 to 1950, there were various different groups listed. Not listed here are Koreans and Hindu, but in other censuses in this time period, those groups were from time to time listed. What's interesting about this 1950s census is it's the first time that an other category was included since 1910. So this is allowing people to choose a race that is not on the list and spelling that out. In 1970, you have this type of census choices here. This is the first year that Hispanic or Latino ethnic origin was included in a census, so this distinction between race and ethnicity was coming to the forefront at that time. And then in 1990, you can see that there's more groups added. Groups such as the Vietnamese, Samoans, Guamanians were all listed as specific categories of Asian Pacific Islanders, for example. And then fast forwarding to the most recent census is the 2010 census. And what's interesting is what I didn't present here was the 2000 census, but the 2000 census was the first census in which someone could identify as multiple races, and they can obviously still do that in 2010. So up until that point, in 1990, you still had to choose just one race. So if somebody was a mixed race, they had to choose one or the other. But in 2000, the US government allowed people to pick more than one race. And so that really is shaping how people can identify. It's a really good example of the external imposition of race upon people. And since 2000, the US government has acknowledged that people should be able to identify as more than one race. So I think it's kind of interesting historical look at how race has been defined. And in the second half of this presentation, we're going to do something quite different, and that is essentially play a game where you try to guess the race or ethnic identity of various celebrities. And I think from doing this, you will sort of reflect upon the socially constructed nature of race, that it is subjectively evaluated. We look at people, we try to place them into racial categories, and this is often done in ways that we don't really consciously think about, but it may be interesting. Now, I do need to admit that I did not create all of these, did not choose all of these celebrities to talk about. A graduate student who's much younger than I am was able to do that, and so she assures me that these are people that you've probably heard of if you are typical college age, but me being a 49-year-old, do not know of all these people. I know most of them, but so if I mispronounce their names, you can laugh to yourself about how clueless I am about pop culture. But regardless of whether I know who these people are, the point is that they may have a racial ethnic identity that would not be guessed by people just looking at them. So the person we want to talk about is Johnny Depp. Um, Now, is he a Native American, Latino, or Hispanic, white European, or Arab Middle Easterner? What do you think? Actually, Johnny Depp is of European heritage, mostly English and French. He does claim to have some Native American ancestry, but but he's not recognized by any Native American tribe. Second, this woman was in the news last year. Would you, looking at her, identify her as black, white, Cuban, or biracial, black and white? Actually, she was very prominent in news because despite the fact that she was born to white parents, she has lived her life as a black woman and identifies as black, and has worked hard to present herself in a way that physically that would lead people to identify her as black. This is a very controversial person that is a white person trying to pass as a black person, right? Which is quite unusual. What about Viola Davis? Is she biracial, black and white? Is she Afro-Latina, black or African American, or biracial, black and Native American? Well, it turns out that she is born to two black parents in South Carolina. So she would identify as black or African American. Rita Ora, what do you think she is? Do you think biracial, white and Latina, white European, or Arab Middle Easterner? Well, she's actually white European. She is born to Albanian parents, and she is a British citizen, but she has a deep connection to her Eastern European roots. Benjamin Bratt, what is his ethnic identity? Native American, Hispanic, Latino, Asian Pacific Islander, or biracial Hispanic and Asian? What do you think? Well, actually, he's his mother is Peruvian and an indigenous group there from Peru, and his father is European American. So he identifies as Latino, and he also is involved in many Native American causes. Probably because he was his mother being from an indigenous population. Zoe, this is a person who I am not familiar with. I'm sure she's famous for one reason or another. Is she, looking at her, would you identify her as black, Afro-Caribbean, West Indian, or biracial, black and white, or Puerto Rican? Actually, she's three of these different categories. She was born to a Dominican father and a Puerto Rican mother. She has discussed in the press that she identifies as a black woman, although some people look at her and have claim that she is not black enough. So this whole concept of not being black enough is, well, something that President Obama has dealt with, and it has to do with the racial authenticity of an individual, and may be driven more by cultural characteristics rather than physical characteristics. It's Cash Warren. Would you identify him as Latino, white, biracial, black and white, or Afro-Caribbean? Actually, he's often mistaken for being Latino, but he's actually biracial, black and white. His father is a black man. How about Gabriella Reese? Is she Latina, white European, biracial black and white, or biracial Latino and white? She's actually was raised by a white mother, but she has a father from Trinidad, And while she wasn't raised by her father's Trinidad, she identifies as biracial, black and white. How about The Rock? Is he um, biracial in combination with black and white, black Asian, black Pacific Islander, or black Latino? Well, he's actually, his mother is Samoan and his father is from Nova Scotia, but a black man from Nova Scotia. So he identifies as black and Pacific Islander, and it's well known that he embraces his biracial identity. So this is actress. The question is she Jewish, Arab, Middle Easterner, Latina, or white European? Well, actually, she has Ukrainian parents who were Jewish heritage, so she identifies as Jewish. Kid Cudi, I'm guessing that's how you pronounce his last name. Is he black or African American, Afro Caribbean, biracial, black and Indian, or biracial, black and Latino? Well, he actually identifies as biracial, black and Latino. His father is of African American descent and Mexican American descent. How about Cameron Diaz? Is she white European? Is she Hispanic? Is she biracial white and Hispanic, or biracial white and Native American? Actually, she is. Her mother is primarily white European with some Native American ancestry, and her father is Cuban descent. So she would identify as biracial, white and Hispanic. Now, what's interesting in her case is her last name Diaz may act as a indicator of her being of Hispanic descent, whereas other people may potentially look at her blonde hair, blue-eyed, and not identify her as Hispanic. But her surname does indicate a potential Hispanic ancestry. How about Keanu Reeves? Is he white European? Is he Native American, Asian Pacific Islander, or biracial white and Asian Pacific Islander? Well, it turns out that he is biracial, identifies as white and Asian Pacific Islander. His mother is British, and his father is British, Portuguese, Native Hawaiian, and some Chinese ancestry as well. Julia Jones, what do you think her identity is? Is she biracial, white and Native American, Indian, South Asian, Asian Pacific Islander, or black, Native American, and white? What do you think? Well, it turns out she is black, Native, or she identifies as black, Native American, and white. So her father has some Native American and African American ancestry, and her mother is white. So she identifies as multi-ethnic. Now, DJ Khaled, how would you imagine he identifies racially? Does he identify as biracial Indian, South Asian, or South Asian Indian? Is he Arab, Middle Eastern, or is he Muslim? Well, he actually identifies as Arab, Middle Eastern. So he was born to two Palestinian parents in the U.S. He was raised as a Muslim, and he is also very much connected with the Southern hip-hop culture. So, interesting example. How about Olivia Munn? Is she Asian Pacific Islander? Is she biracial white and Hawaiian? Is she biracial white and Vietnamese? Or is she South Asian or Malaysian? Turns out that she is, while she was raised in Japan, her father is white, her mother was Vietnamese, so she identifies as biracial white and Vietnamese. How about Bob Marley? Definitely somebody I know about. All right. So does he identify as Jamaican, black, Afro-Caribbean, or biracial white or black and white? Turns out that it's all four. He was born in Jamaica to an Afro-Caribbean mother. He had an absentee white father. Some sources indicate that he resents his father and often felt as an outcast both in the white and black communities. And later in his life, he identified as Pan-African, or among Pan-African belief system. How about Nora Jones? She identify as Israeli, as biracial white and Middle Eastern, as Indian, or biracial white and Indian. Turns out that she identifies as biracial white and Indian. So she has a white mother, but her father was from India. So there's a 15 or so people you look at and you think about what their identity is. Hopefully I didn't go through that too quick and you're able to sort of get a sense of what these people's identities were. And so what's interesting, the question is, how is this related to what we've talked about so far in our class? Clearly we've talked about how race is a social construction. People look at physical characteristics of an individual and potentially their name, and they try to categorize someone into these preconceived notions of what racial categories exist. The point of doing this exercise is to point out that people's self-identity is often not the identity that might be imposed upon them, that people may identify in ways that are not seen as consistent with their physical characteristics, and so that may still have consequences. The externally imposed ethnic identity can have consequences for their lives and their life chances. And so hopefully thinking about this, you will be more aware of such issues and less likely to impose a racial identity on someone. I mean, I've taught for over 20 years in college campuses, and often teaching race and ethnic relations classes, and what I've come to realize is that these externally imposed identities that we place upon people is often much more simplistic than what their own individual identity is, and you are often incorrect when you're imposing an ethnic identity on someone based solely on what they look like. So I hope you find this interesting. If you are so inclined, I would encourage you to write an extra credit essay associated with this presentation and linking it to the ideas we've had in our class. And these requirements for this extra credit paper are posted on our iCollege webpage, and I look forward to reading your feedback on these ideas. So thank you very much for listening.